Thank you very much. So this is joint work with Massimo Morelli, and this so what we're doing in this paper, similar to the paper from that we saw from Scott and Ethan before, is looking at the multitask issues that are facing politicians, the decision of how to allocate time across competing goals. But we'll take a very different approach and focus on issues that differ in a very different way than they did. So we'll look at a setting where instead of being differentiated in terms of competence, individuals are differentiated in terms of ideology, and issues are differ in terms of how important they are and how polarizing they are, how divisive they are. And so basically the questions we have here are like, why would politicians focus on issues that are polarizing at the expense of common values? At least it seems like they do this fairly often. Why would we think they may not focus on the issues that are viewed as the most important? So why might the issues that they focus on not correspond to those? And finally, how does transparency affect the incentives for politicians to focus on one issue versus the other? Does transparency cause them to focus on the more important issues, the more common values issues, or does it have the opposite effect? Under what circumstances? So I think there's a strong sense that there's sort of a disproportional amount of time and attention exerted on certain issues that are considered more divisive, more extreme issues. I put up a couple of quotes here. One was Austin Goolsbee from a couple days after he stepped down as from the Council of Economic Advisors, and he was shaking his head asking, can't we wait on the things we're going to yell at each other about and start on the things we agree on? And then I also put up a quote from Morris Fiorina discussing how, at least in his opinion, a disproportionate amount of time and attention is spent on things like abortion, gun control, and the Pledge of Allegiance that he would argue doesn't motivate the majority of Americans. And basically what we're going to ask is, if this is true, why are such issues going to receive so much attention? So we'll consider a two-period model with all of the failings inherent in that. So there'll be an incumbent politician who has to decide how to allocate their time across two different issues. We'll assume that one issue is common values and one that is divisive. So we'll make a very stark assumption here. We'll assume, to make everything sort of the most stark and I think the most interesting, that the common values issue is more important, and just that voters will be unsure of the politicians' preferences, particularly be unsure of the politicians' preferences on the divisive issue. They'll see what the politician does and then decide whether to re-elect them or not based on the inference they draw from how they behaved in office. And basically the main idea, it's a very, very simple model, is that this creates an incentive to exert excessive efforts on the more divisive issues at the expense of the common values issue, because there's more room for updating about the politician's preferences, and so for career incentives, create the incentive to over-provide effort on those issues. Okay. So basically what we'll find is that when re-election concerns are dominant, then politicians will focus on the more divisive issue, even if it's less important. It doesn't matter whether it's more or less important, but even if it is less important. Basically, in order to show that they're not in the minority, they have an incentive to emphasize the divisive issue, over-provide effort on the majority position on that, even more than the majority type voters would like, and that this incentives can at least potentially lead to Pareto-dominated first period effort choices. And then in the second half of the paper, we'll ask what happens if we make the way the politician allocates their time more transparent, and see what happens there. Well, obviously it can be beneficial in many ways. The parameter space that we're going to focus on is at a time when transparency can be harmful, and it can be harmful both in terms of disciplining and sorting simultaneously. So you can think of various examples: excessive amount of time spent on various things, from PBS funding to Terry Schiavo, but we'll just move on as well, talking about from the related literature, and just go ahead to the model. But basically what we're looking at is a multitask environment, similar to Scott and Ethan's paper. There'll be no possibility for contracting, but we'll differ in terms of what the heterogeneity is over. And in our paper, it's going to be about preferences and about issue divisiveness as opposed to competence. Okay. So the model, basically what we'll assume is that the politician, the incumbent politician, has to decide how to allocate effort across two issues. So this could be effort or sort of any other scarce resource, such as money, personnel. You have a certain number of things you'd like to do, and you have to decide which to dedicate the resources to actually accomplishing. So what we assume is that there's a status quo policy that's 0. And by exerting effort on each of the two issues, we'll call the issues A and B, they can move with some probability the policy from being 0 to the policy becoming 1. Right? So basically, so what we assume is that they have a total allocation of time W, where W is greater than 0, so it's positive, they can do something, and less than 2, which means that they can't do everything. And they decide how much effort or how much to dedicate to issue A and how much to dedicate to issue B with the assumption that they can only put up to 1 on each issue. And basically what the WA and WB, the amount of effort they're allocating to A and B are doing is switching the policy from 0 to 1 with probability equal to the amount of effort they placed onto the issue. Right? So if they put WA on issue A, it switches from 0 to 1 with probability, probability WA. Right? Now W is just meant to index sort of how much power the politician has to pursue her agenda. So if we think of W being very close to 0, this might represent a freshman congressman or a backbencher who has very little ability to pursue their agenda, whereas you could imagine the president having a higher W and a prime minister having substantially higher W than a president. Okay, so basically it'll be a 2-period model. And so the payoffs in each stage game are going to depend upon the difference between the preferred policy in each dimension and the implemented policy in each dimension. Right? So the first dimension, A, is a common values dimension. In the common values dimension, everybody wants the policy, PTA, which will be either 0 and 1, in part depending upon how much effort was exerted on the A issue. And the distance between that and the state of the world, which will be theta t, which will be the same for everybody. Right? Potentially, we may not know what theta t is, but we'll talk about that a little sooner. But basically, theta t will be a 0-1 variable. Do we want policy? Does everyone want policy 1, or does everybody want policy 0? And pt will either be 0 and 1. So we get disutility minus gamma if we don't get our preferred policy in that dimension. Right. Now the second part is the B dimension, and then we have similar preferences there. We have the concern for the policy that's implemented PTB, which is the policy in the B dimension, and everyone cares how close that is to their preferred policy in the B dimension, which similarly could be either 0 or 1. We index the preferred policy of an individual in the B dimension by I for this individual I, because there's heterogeneity in that dimension in terms of the preferred preferences. And then finally, we're adding a valence shock to the politicians. This is just so that that re-election probabilities will be continuous in beliefs and increasing in the belief that you're congruent or that you're the majority type. So we'll assume that there is some random valence shock so that nobody can perfectly forecast whether they'll be re-elected or not. Right. Now we're going to assume that gamma is greater than 1/2, which means there's greater disutility to not getting your preferred policy in the A dimension than the B dimension. So the A dimension is more important. The common values dimension is more important. And we'll focus on the case where theta 0, the preferred policy in the first dimension is 1. So we would like effort to be exerted on issue 1 and have the policy move from 0 to 1 in the A dimension. Okay. So this then creates a non-trivial multitask problem because individuals want, or it's in the voters' interest for politicians to exert effort on the A issue and exert full effort on the A issue, but because of our assumption that W is less than 2, they can't exert full effort on both issues. Right? And then, of course, there'll be a second period that's discounted by some rate, but as we've discussed, we won't really talk about comparison across the other areas. So the A issue is a common values issue. We're going to assume that on the common values issue, the state could either be 0 or 1 tomorrow, and it'll be 1 with probability Q. That will be less. There will be some number less than 1. Basically, we're going to assume with some positive probability that we'll be happy with whatever the status quo in the A issue is tomorrow. We'll talk about why we make that assumption in a couple of slides. The B issue is divisive, and so some fraction m greater than 1/2 would like effort being exerted on issue B, and some fraction, whereas the remainders would not like effort exerted on issue B, and so would rather just stick with the status quo policy on the B dimension and not want it to move to policy 1. The assumption that Q will be less than 1 is going to guarantee that there's at least some opportunity for disagreement in the second period after the electoral concerns are no longer apply, and that is just going to be a modeling trick to ensure that the policy preferences of the candidates are important to the voters. Okay, so politicians have basically exactly the same preferences as voters, excepting that we assume just for simplicity they don't care about the valence of the incumbent, and that they also get some benefit, which we're calling phi, from holding office above and beyond their policy concerns. Now, politicians are drawn from the electorate. We're not modeling how they're drawn from the electorate, but since they're drawn from the electorate, the pool they're drawn from some subset of politicians. If there's no heterogeneity in the A dimension for the voters, there wouldn't be in politicians either. And then there'd be some heterogeneity in terms of the ideal points of the politicians. They may have the same distribution as the voters, they may not. And voters basically are going to see what politicians do when they're in office and then update their beliefs about the politicians. Okay. So just to go through the model, it basically starts, initially a politician is randomly selected, made the incumbent, just grabbed off the street and stuck in office. The politician is going to decide how to allocate effort, WA and WB, decide how much time to spend on each of the two issues. The voters are then going to see this effort decision, although later we'll talk about the case where they don't see the effort decision. Instead, all they see are the outcomes of the politician's choices. The valence is realized and publicly observed and going to be constant across periods. So because it's constant across periods and realized after the choice of policy, it's going to affect whether the individual, the incumbent gets reelected or not. And so when politicians, when choosing policy, are going to be uncertain as to whether they'll get reelected. All players receive their utilities for the initial period. There'll be an election by majority rule where if you don't retain the incumbent, a random replacement is drawn and picked up off the street and dropped into office. And then the state of the world is realized for the second period, and the politician decides on their effort allocation in the second period, in the final period, and with the payoffs being received. Okay. So now in the second period, or which may not be the ideal notation, is period t equals to 1, is when the politicians are going to be electorally unaccountable. So if there's this A dimension that we all agree is supremely important, in the absence of electoral concerns, everyone's going to address it if it has any value, if we indeed want it to be addressed, if theta 1 is equal to 1. And so in that case, what we'll get is that the majority type will first do A, and then put any leftover time they have on B. And the minority type, if they're in office, they don't like doing B. They prefer the 0 policy to the 1 policy on B. So they're certainly never going to exert any effort to getting the one policy in B. And so they won't spend any time on B. So the second period behavior for different types will be different, at least with positive probability, and this will then ensure that the politician's type is relevant for the voters. It'll be different either in the case where W is higher than 1, or the case where we've realized that the state on the A dimension is equal to 1. Okay. Great. And so then, of course, since we're voting by majority rule, the majority type voter is going to be decisive for deciding whether the incumbent gets reelected or not. They like politicians who are congruent with them, and so what we get is that the probability of reelected is, from the incumbent's perspective, is going to be strictly increasing in the voter's belief that they are the majority type. And so then this, of course, creates a signaling game where the incumbent politician wants to convince the voters that they are the majority type. Right. Now, it's a signaling game, so because it's a signaling game, there's going to be a lot of equilibrium. What we're going to do is focus on the unique equilibria that satisfies criterion D1. Not to say that's the only equilibria that could be interesting, but that will be the equilibrium that we're going to focus on. Basically how this is going to work is that because the majority types have a greater incentive to spend time on B than the minority types do, it may distract them from doing A, which they may prefer doing. They at least get some utility from trying to pass B, whereas the minority types not only are distracted from issue A, but also get disutility from pursuing B. This means that the majority types have a greater incentive to exert effort on B, and then basically criterion D1 says that if we see too much B, we should think that's because they're the majority type, and if we see too little, it should indicate that they're the minority type. And with this restriction, the equilibrium is going to be unique. Okay. So the results with transparent effort, so it's a pretty simple signaling game. Basically, if the re-election concerns are not too strong, the main concern of the politicians is going to be, what policy do I implement today? I don't really value re-election that much. But then there's still a possibility for the majority type to separate by putting just a little bit of effort on B. And so what we get is in this case, when the re-election concerns are not too strong, that we get a separating equilibrium where the minority type puts a little bit of time on B, and the minority type doesn't mimic them and instead just loses re-election, but by not being willing to engage in this sort of costly signaling. But of course, when the re-election pressures are stronger, the primary concern of politicians is to secure re-election. The minority types are certainly not going to let the majority type separate, so they'd mimic. And what we'd get in the unique D1 equilibrium is a pooling equilibrium, and a pooling equilibrium on which politicians first focus on the B issue. Right? So they all sort of do maximally B, and then spend any leftover time that they may have on A in the initial period. Right. And now, potentially in between, we won't be able, for intermediate levels, we won't be able to support either a pooling or a separating equilibrium. And then, as you might expect, we get a partial pooling equilibrium. So basically what we get is that if the re-election concerns are strong, we'll get an equilibrium that we'll call a posturing equilibrium, where people are just spending time on issues that are known not to be as important in an effort to signal their preferences. And we'll get an equilibrium that will involve pooling, where everybody is focusing on the divisive issue B. Right? Now, this is, of course, bad for first period welfare, because we're doing something that's spending our time on something that's bad for some group of the population and not as good as something else for another subgroup of the subset of the population. But it's also, of course, bad for selecting majority types and for learning about politicians, because in a pooling equilibrium, we don't really learn anything. And so that's going to be what we'll talk about soon as we continue on. But just before we get to the non-transparency, one comparative static result that I think is kind of interesting is that you can calculate the thresholds for which we get the various ranges of equilibrium, the separating equilibrium versus the equilibrium where they're pooling on sort of full effort on the B dimension. And what we find is that that's going to be increasing in W when W is less than 1, and then decreasing when W is greater than 1. So sort of a situation where if you have very little authority, you spend a whole lot of time posturing. Similarly, if you have the ability to do a whole lot of things, this posturing behavior isn't particularly damaging. It's sort of in the intermediate stage where it's starkest, where you could do something, but you can't do everything, where there's the greatest possibility for a separating equilibrium and sort of the least incentive to engage in this harmful posturing. Great. So now what we'll talk about is the issues of transparency and what happens if instead of observing exactly the actions that are taken, voters can only observe the outcomes. Right? So now in this case, we think of that this is often a more reasonable case. We can't always see exactly what people are doing all the time. And of course, we can also often control the degree of transparency through various institutional factors, such as where we allow cameras and so on. Right. So in this case, voters don't see the effort allocation. They don't see the WA, the WB, how much time is spent on the two issues. But what they do see instead is the resulting policy, as to whether the policy was 0 or whether the policy was 1. Now, what's important here is that when we had transparency, politicians could signal with their effort choices what their preferences were, but also know that what they've done may not actually be implemented and so not affect policy. Right. Now, with non-transparency, in terms of how you exerted effort, but only over the policy outcomes, the signaling value from doing B is only going to be received if the B policy actually is received. Right. So this would fairly obviously make the engaging in this posturing, emphasizing B, less desirable for politicians. Right? And potentially this can break us out of our pooling equilibrium, leading to better outcomes. Now, equilibrium selection is still going to be an issue. But what we're just going to do is say we'll focus on the case where the equilibria in which the majority type politician behaves in the same way as they had done in the transparent case, since we're sort of further afield of the typical signaling models and similar and refinements, and then and focus on that equilibrium, and particularly when the reelection motive is strong, which is probably the most interesting case. Right. So the first thing we could look at is what's the case when W is less than 1. So that's a case where the politician is not capable of guaranteeing that they accomplish either one of the issues. Now, in this case, certainly we can't have a pooling equilibrium when effort allocation is non-transparent. Why? Well, because in that case, even if I as a minority type had completely mimicked the majority type, with positive probability, we're not going to see the issue B actually be accomplished. Right? The voters are not updating about competence here, so they're only updating about how I would have allocated my time. So in this case, in a pooling equilibrium, they're not going to update at all about me. But then since I didn't like doing I didn't like doing B, I have no incentive to do B. Right? But if I'm caught spending time on A, then that still would reveal that I'm not focusing on B as the majority type was. So in equilibrium, what you get is that the minority types would randomize between doing B and doing nothing. So here you get a trade-off between sort of first period welfare and the future and selection, but it sort of goes in the opposite direction of what we often see in these sorts of models, where the transparency or increasing transparency would improve first period welfare, but make sort of sorting worse. Now, I think it is very important here, of course, though, that politicians, there's no possibility for updating in a way like what we had in Scott and Ethan's paper, where you're trying to signal competence, because then you'd have an effect where you want to try to signal that you can do multiple things, and that would certainly go in the opposite direction of what we had here. Right. So the case that we think is perhaps most interesting is the case where W is greater than 1. So now, in W is greater than 1, it's possible to ensure, if you so choose, to get one of the policies accomplished with certainty. Right? Now, when effort allocations were transparent, any deviation is going to reveal the politician to be the minority type with certainty. But this is not always the case when effort is non-transparent. Now, since the main cost to doing B to a minority type is not that they had to do B, it's that they couldn't do A, and A was the more important one, this then suggests another possible deviation. And what you could do as a politician is deviate to focus on doing A first, and then put whatever additional effort you had on B. And then because there's still a positive probability, probability W minus 1, that issue B will actually still be successful, in which case you'll get reelected at least with a significant probability. That gives you, it sort of greatly dampens the reelection, the reputational damage. Right, or makes this deviation doesn't cost you reelection probability that much. So basically, if you do the calculation, you're seeing that because everything is set up linearly here, as you decide how much to deviate away from putting full effort on B, as you transition to A, both the change in your reelection probability and the payoffs in terms of expected first period payoffs are linear, and so they're proportional. But then once you can no longer keep going to issue A, now you get less and less gains from deviating. So for a wider range of parameters, you have an incentive to engage in this deviation and first do A. So in order to prevent this deviation, you're going to need a strictly higher valuation from holding office. And that means that on this interval between the phi star, the range for which we get the posturing equilibrium under non-transparency, and phi star NA, the range where we get the posturing equilibrium with non-transparency over actions, we break out of the pooling equilibrium. The minority type is going to focus more time on A. They'll still spend some time on B, but they'll focus more of their time on A. And so what this is going to mean is that in this case, because they'll focus more time on the more important issue in the first period, and we'll also learn more about politicians in the first period as well. So this means that what we get is that this non-transparency will be beneficial both in terms of the first period welfare and for sorting of politicians and for learning about politicians, at least on this interval. Right? So we could think of this as an example of cable news following politicians around all the time. Now they spend all their time posturing for their cameras. Since they're so guarded, since they spend all the time doing what they think of as politically expedient, instead that we don't actually learn anything about them in the process, or that we learn less. Okay, so there's a few other points about why these distinctions, but since it's the last talk, I think I'll just sort of move off to the end and say, so basically what we're looking at is how politicians divide their effort across different policies. We've said that we've shown that there's an incentive for politicians to over-provide effort on the more divisive issues due to their signaling value. Right? I mean, we've focused in this case basically entirely on negative distortions that are caused by reelection pressures, as opposed to the more positive pressures that we saw a few minutes ago. And so this will lead to a distortion in which issues are addressed, and certainly while transparency can be good or bad, what we found is that when we have sort of efficient institutions, somebody who has the ability to accomplish multiple tasks at once, who's very office motivated, transparency can lead to sort of more posturing, which can have a harmful effect both in terms of the behavior in the first period and in terms of the future selection of majority-type politicians. Great. So thank you very much.
Hello. Somehow this feels ridiculous. Anyway, so hi, I'm Sean Gailmard from UC Berkeley Political Science. And I was delighted to read this paper. It's really a pleasure to do so. It's interesting because it has a really compelling logic, like a lot of Richard's papers do, and a simple, logic, but also kind of subtle. And this one taps into a longstanding issue in American politics, which is about why politicians spend so much time on, this sideshow of divisive values issues like gay marriage, and Terry Schiavo, like you mentioned, and then the main event of common values issues go neglected or get short shrift, and also why do voters reward people who talk about these kinds of values issues but ignore their general economic interests? and you don't really talk about this too much in the talk or in the paper, but it really connects into the whole what's the matter with Kansas discussion that we've kind of been having in this country since, well, I don't know, there was a book called What's the Matter with Kansas in 2006 or 7 or whatever it was. And so it's become kind of an important theme, and we have some simplistic behavioral takes on it that assume that, and this is one of the things I really like about this paper, is it assumes that the divisive issue actually does have real welfare implications for voters. And you get this suboptimal effort allocation due to a reelection motive, but it's not the simplistic analysis that, by politicians, I guess the simplistic story is that politicians focus on these divisive issues sort of to distract voters from pursuing policies that are against their interests on the real major important issues. That's definitely not the case in this paper. It's a much more charitable take on values voters than you usually get in something like the What's the Matter with Kansas discussion, because the assumption in the paper is that the divisive issue does have real welfare consequences for voters. Anyway, I mean, it's a longstanding discussion. We have President Obama in his campaign talked about frustrated voters clinging to guns and God, and Larry Bartels tells us that in fact there's nothing the matter with Kansas, that working class whites vote the same way they have basically always voted outside of the South, and it's like you have enough overlapping characteristics on a set of voters you're looking at, and things have always been the same for those people. You also have models of values voting comes about because you get a warm glow from expressive behavior on these issues, and you have a low pivot probability. You don't affect your instrumental utility on the economic issues, so you can focus on the warm glow of the values issues. We even earlier today, this paper kind of links in with the Matozzi and Snowberg paper, which talks about one side of it, why do we get these kinds of policies that are against the economic interests of voters? Well, it's in that paper, it's one side of a trade-off that gives you good politicians who have high effort. I mean, there's a lot of differences between these models, but they do have this sort of common theme to them. And so this paper offers a new take about what we should infer from politicians allocating their effort in this way, and why we should think about voters rewarding politicians who do. And it's an attempt to signal, as Richard was very clear in the talk, it's an attempt to signal preferences on a divisive issue, which is never more important than a common values issue, but does have real welfare consequences. Because it's never more important than the common values issue, the effort allocation has got to be suboptimal. There are a couple, so basically the setup is a multitask moral hazard model, but there's also an adverse selection dimension, and that is whether the politician's preferences match up with the majority's preferences on the divisive issue. We know they're going to match up on the common values issue. That's what it means to be a common values issue. There's some question as to whether they will match up on the divisive issue. So it's a multitask moral hazard model, but there's also an adverse selection component. We know in this setting that elections cannot function, and I think Ethan and Scott have made this point very clearly in some of their earlier work. Elections cannot function as both a selection device and a disciplining device, because voters will definitely not, once they update their beliefs after the first period, they will not be indifferent ex post about different candidate types. They will prefer one over the other, and so all that's left is for elections to work as a selection device. And so this paper, that logic looms very heavily in this paper, and it really pushes that feature of elections with adverse selection to a very sort of harsh limit in terms of voter welfare, in the sense that you can actually have politicians choose actions that make voters worse off in the first period, and voters will still reelect them because they know that what they've learned is relevant for the voters' welfare in the second period. So just a couple things, about a couple aspects about the model, just to review the main points. It's a binary. There's a binary policy on each issue. A couple things are somewhat stylized about it, and it would be nice to see maybe this paper is one of these papers that's half the free world has already read and offered comments on this paper. So I cannot imagine that there's a single new thing for me to tell you at this point, but I'll gamely try anyway. So there are a couple of somewhat stylized elements of the model that I think it would be useful to try to push on. First of all, the policy technology is the same for both issues. The production function of new policy is the same for both issues. What happens is the politicians put in effort on an issue, and that translates into a probability of policy change. Policies are binary in each dimension, and politicians differ in their effort budget and in their preferences on the divisive issue, but the policy technology is the same for both issues, so the production function is the same for both issues. So when you think about what it means for an issue to be divisive, you might think, well, that's an issue on which it's harder to change policy. That's not true in this model. So I think it loses something of the flavor of what I think of as a divisive issue. And I think you could, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute. I think there, when I think about the logic of sort of what happens in that world and why, I think I still might prefer politicians who signal their type on that divisive issue, even in a world where, you have some coalition formation problems or something, and it's harder to do stuff on the divisive dimension. So I think that the results are robust to that. Whether this is true or not, it's sort of not the point in a model like this. It's designed to illustrate a logic of how elections work. But, the assumption is that the divisive issue, while it has real welfare consequences for voters, is never itself more important. The importance of policy change for voters on the common values issue can be big or small, or put differently, they can either like or not like the status quo on the common values dimension. And if the value of changing the status quo on the common values dimension is big, then that's what everybody wants to do. And if it's small, they're happy with policy change on the divisive issue. But the divisive issue, the importance of the divisive issue does not in itself vary. It's not possible for the divisive issue to be the more important one for the politicians to work on. So, in the quote-unquote real world, and the real world coalition is still there, so yeah, that's to you guys. Maybe it is possible for the divisive values issue to be more important. And so there might be some loss of verisimilitude by assuming it's not. The point of the model is not to, it's a model. It's designed to illustrate the logic of how elections work and a bad thing they can do. Whether they actually, in fact, do that in the parameter space that the real world is a slice of is a different question. But at any rate, it is a stylized assumption. I'm not entirely sure it's true. I think that maybe the most stylized aspect of the model maybe you could say something about what the robustness of the results to is the fact that if the politician changes the divisive policy in period 1, it goes back to that same status quo in period 2. And so there's a sort of, it's like, well, okay, we'll make gay marriage, well, we're just going to say for sure, gay marriage is definitely not consistent with federal. We're just going to pass the Defense of Marriage Act once, and then suddenly it goes away. And then in the next period, Defense of Marriage Act went away, we have to pass it again. The status quo reverts to the anti-majoritarian outcome in every single period. And that is important because that's why it's always valuable for voters to know that they're going to get the politician of the future who matches their preferences on the divisive issue, right? That is what's crucial about making the adverse selection dimension important, is that there are future welfare implications for getting the right guy who matches your preferences on that issue. It's not like, okay, we got that Defense of Marriage Act nonsense out of the way, now let's get on to the real business of the common values issues. So it's kind of stylized, and maybe you have an answer for how that doesn't matter one tiny little bit, and then you will tell us also, and I'll feel a lot better, but I would like to hear that. So anyway, so the logic is pretty straightforward, given the fact that the divisive value, that a match of the preferences between the politician and the majority does matter in the second period on the divisive value issue. Everybody will address the common values issue first if it is desirable to do so in the second period. And if there's any effort budget left over in the second period, the majoritarian politicians on the divisive issue will spend their effort changing the policy on that issue, and the minoritarian politicians won't do anything. So basically, the issue is pretty simple. Any representative, if I'm in the majority on the divisive issue, any representative will pursue my interests on the common value issue should it come up. It's common values. So I might as well focus all my effort on trying to get somebody who will also pursue my interest on the divisive values issue, in case there's effort left, in case the common values issue isn't important or there's effort left to focus on it. And so voters prefer somebody who signals themselves to be the majoritarian politician. And so there's a lot of effort in the paper, and it's nice and it's well developed logic about how the D1 criterion applies in this setting. But long story short, so what we get is that since the majoritarian politicians have a greater willingness to take action in the first period in pursuit of the policy change on the divisive issue, because the status quo is anti-majoritarian for some reason, then the voter will infer from this action that the politician is majoritarian. And then you saw the results that if the office has high intrinsic value, we're going to get a pooling equilibrium where everybody is pursuing first period policy change on the divisive issue because they're all desperate to keep their job. So they all want to signal that they are willing to pursue the voters' interest on the divisive issue. And so what you wind up with is there's a pooling equilibrium, voters can't tell, and then they vote based on some small, you have peppercorn-sized variance in this valence term that decides everything as a random variable. But if office has low intrinsic value, the minoritarian politicians won't spend any first period effort on the divisive issue because doing so to win re-election is not worth it for them. They would have to thereby incur the cost of changing policy on the divisive issue, which they don't want to do. So that's the general logic of it. Okay, so what should we infer from observing about the optimality of effort allocation in a world where we see politicians spend more effort on the divisive issue than on the common values issue? Well, we might infer what this model tells us that there's been a suboptimal effort allocation. We might also infer maybe the policy technology is different for these types of issues. You talk about, Mo Fiorina's quote about what most Americans want is a safe country and a sound economy. Well, I don't know how to choose a policy to get a safe country or a sound economy. I'm just going to have one, Whereas if I want to have a country where, marriage is between a man and a woman, I am pretty sure how to choose that policy. You just say in a law that's what marriage is between a man and a woman. So there's, so you have two policy dimensions. One of them is a complete information map. I think the values dimensions are really easy policies to choose. There's this complete information mapping, and it seems like maybe on the common values issues, there's a lot of uncertainty about, in the sort of, X equals, P plus omega type of sense, or perhaps more grandiosely about the relationship between policy choices and outcomes. No, I'm not saying that doesn't lead to some suboptimality in effort allocation. Maybe it does. Maybe it's, maybe that would be another paper to write, is how, elections induce politicians to shift their effort working on policies where you have complete information, mappings from choices to outcomes, and they shift away from spending effort to learn the mapping for policies where there's incomplete information. That's still a type of suboptimality, okay? But maybe we should infer that, so you can't infer that from this model because the two policy issues have the exact same technology, as I was saying. Also, what should we infer about voters from the fact that they like people who spend time on divisive issues? This is where I was thinking about, again, an asymmetry in the policy technology across these dimensions. Divisive issues are hard to change, and common values issues they're easy to change. And so if you think about it in terms of like there actually are multiple politicians voting on this, so because in this paper there's just one, politician who's doing everything and one voter, but on common values issues, when they come on the agenda, they're going to have lopsided coalitions. And so if I'm going to choose a representative based on one of these dimensions, they're a lot more likely to be pivotal on divisive issues. And so I could focus a lot of attention, in selecting a representative on the divisive issue because it's one where they'll matter. Now that really is a very similar logic to yours. Is like, well, I'm going to get the common values policy is going to be the same no matter who I pick. And the divisive issues policy, my guy, could be pivotal. But that reflects something about a greater difficulty of policy change on the divisive issues. So if you could get something like that for free, essentially for free, and maybe you could build something in about, different costs of, or you have lower efficacy of effort on the divisive issue, would be some way of representing that. I think you'd really get the exact same point. And then I guess one other thing I kept wondering about, is, well, you mentioned in the talk, you're not going to talk about how the politicians got to be selected from the electorate to be in office, but it is it is sort of in the spirit of a model. You take the starting point as given. You see, is there an interesting, subtle, surprising nugget that's pretty robust and that says something interesting about this institution, taking those initial conditions as given? And yes, there definitely is. But it is a little bit strange that we happen to find ourselves, with this politician that maybe we have this issue that's always on the agenda, the divisive issue. It's always on the agenda. It's always against the majority's preferences. And maybe we have this politician who's anti-majoritarian. How did it happen that the initial selection, it's a boring comment, it's cheap, but I don't know, it kind of matters. How did it happen that the initial selection of the politician turned out to be so bad for the interests of the majority of voters? And I guess you'd have to think it was something like an incumbent who had been serving for 30 years and they were first elected when everybody had the sense that, why are we talking about gay marriage? Why are we talking about that, in 1975 in the federal government? So you start electing, Jack Murtha, and he's just there for decades, and then all of a sudden you find this thing on the agenda. It's like, oh, you're anti-majoritarian on this issue. I guess it would be something like that. So I guess it's not incredible, but it's a little. I don't know. It's a little bit sketchy as far as like the initial selection in the first place. But anyway, I highly commend and recommend this paper, and I really enjoyed reading it. So, thanks.
Thank you. That was great. I don't have a whole lot to say in response. I think most of the things you highlighted, such as the selection of politicians, we don't really have a story here. I guess what we could think of in terms of that as being a case where, so before the election, no one's ever going to reveal they're the minority type. Then when they're in office, they have some authority, but at least at some point in the future, they might feel less constrained. And so like before the election, if there is an election stage, everyone's just going to say, I'm the majority type. And then in office, they decide what to do, but we still are not entirely sure how, if they were free from electoral constraints, what they do, or what, for example, a president would do in the second term when they didn't have re-election. If you see like at least some people and at least some hysterical conspiracy theories about what Obama was going to do the first day of his second term. There are at least some people who harbored thoughts that politicians' behavior may change in the future. Although I completely take your point, and one of the weaknesses of these models, to go along with the artificial second period, is the artificial start, which is just we grab somebody off the street and stick them in and say that this is the president, and we have no idea anything about them or no idea their preferences, and so that's certainly certainly an issue. So regarding the policy technology, yes, so we just assume there's the same production technology for the divisive issue and the common values issue. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same. You could add additional parameters, and then there's just a different assumption than the gamma being 1/2 to say that effort is more valuable on the common values issue than the divisive issue to everybody. Where if you have, for example, rescaled, it's not entirely clear to me which direction it would go in terms of it being harder to accomplish things on the divisive or common value, largely for the issues that you raised. So on a divisive issue, it's probably really hard to get something passed, or a lot harder to get something passed than a common values. But common values are probably the bigger issues and the harder issues where there's more informational concerns. So it seems like it could go either direction, and perhaps we should add parameters to allow for that, and then you just get a more complicated version. of the condition we have that's more complicated than the gamma greater than 1/2, but basically reflects the same thing. So then there's the issue of the returning to the status quo tomorrow. That's one of the things that I would take to be sort of highly stylized than sort of taking literally, in terms of we think of that your preferences are that it may that so there's only sort of one divisive issue here, and it's one issue on which it's against the majority preferences. I'd always think of this as more there'd be potentially lots of different issues, and at least one of them goes against the majority preferences, and so presumably at least one of them will go against the majority preferences tomorrow, and as long as your preferences are correlated on this issue on the issue that you're addressing today, or that we're talking about today, with the one that could come up tomorrow, then it seems like it should work. But we didn't really want to build the broader thing with the various different issues. But perhaps I could sort of do more to make that, or to sort of try to justify what was going on there. But thank you very much. I really appreciate it.